Hey there. Tonight, we are stepping into a city where the first kings were said to descend from heaven, where clay tablets remembered impossible reigns, where the stars were measured with unsettling patience, and where the oldest scribes left behind a quiet warning that never fully went away. If this kind of slow and shadowed history is your place to rest, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, then settle in with me. Let the room grow dim. Let your jaw unclench. Let your shoulders fall. Breathe slowly, and allow the dust of ancient Sumer to drift over the noise of the modern world. Imagine the land before the city walls, before the baked brick towers, before the reed boats pressing through the brown water. The plain lies low and wide beneath a pale sky. The air is warm, still, and heavy with river breath. Mud holds the memory of every footstep. Water folds around reeds with a soft sound, and beyond that soft sound, there is a silence so broad that it almost feels watchful. Honestly, I have always found it strange that the first great civilization seems to begin not with a stumble, but with the confident voice of someone entering a room already knowing the answer. That is the first eerie thing about Sumer. It arrives with its hands already full. By the tiny earliest cities begin to rise from the southern Mesopotamian plain, the people there are not scratching at the edge of knowledge. They are writing. They are measuring. They are building on platforms with careful mathematical balance. They are managing grain, labor, time, and ritual as if someone had handed them not only a city, but the instructions for keeping it alive. The old tablets do not speak in the tone of children learning to stand. They speak in the tone of clerks who are already late for work. The accepted story likes a smooth staircase. First this, then that, then a slightly better version of that. A hut becomes a village. A village becomes a town. A town becomes a city. But Sumer can feel less like a staircase and more like a lamp lit all at once in a dark room. When archaeologists cut through the layers of places like Uruk, Eridu, and Nippur, they do not find a simple little trail of clumsy attempts leading neatly to brilliance. They find brilliance very early. They find cities with complicated sacred centers. They find writing that is already being asked to do heavy work. They find mathematics that is not merely counting sheep, but organizing the sky. And the scribes themselves, in their dry, practical way, keep pointing upward. The kingship descended from heaven. There it is, again and again, not whispered as a secret, not tucked away in a fringe corner, but written into the deep memory of the civilization. The authority came down. The order came down. The first right to rule did not crawl out of the marsh grass. It descended. Now, whether we take that as sacred symbolism, mythic memory, political theater, or something stranger, the sentence sits there with remarkable calm. It does not shout. It does not plead to be believed. It simply waits. So let us walk slowly. The morning opens over Eridu first, because in the old records, that is where the story likes to begin. Eridu, the city of beginnings, low and holy, damp with the nearness of the sweet underground waters the Sumerians imagined below the earth. You can picture the temple rising from mud brick and reed matting, sunlight striking plaster, workers moving in small lines, carrying baskets, jars, and tools. The smell is clay, fish, smoke, wet reed, warm dust. A city is not born in a triumphant fanfare. It is born in labor, in carrying, in smoothing walls with the palm, in measuring one more foundation trimage before the heat grows cruel. Yet even here, at the supposed beginning, the system is already layered. Temples do not stand alone as places of prayer. They are storehouses, workshops, observatories, archives, and engines of power. Grain flows in. Offerings flow out. Rituals are scheduled. Calendars matter. Someone watches the sky because planting must answer to time. Someone records deliveries because fields and flocks do not govern themselves. Someone calculates. Someone supervises. Someone knows where the water should go before it goes there. This is where the old unease begins to gather, because skill like that usually leaves a longer trail behind it. And still, the trail feels strangely short. The earliest layers of Sumerian civilization already contain a people who know how to divide a circle, how to standardize labor, how to align ritual with celestial order, how to lay out sacred architecture with a seriousness that suggests precedent. There are tablets with numbers. There are signs becoming writing. There are legal and administrative habits forming quickly. There is the sexagesimal system, base 60, elegant and useful, still echoing in the hours on your clock and the degrees in a circle. You know that feeling when you discover something ancient and realize it has been hiding inside your daily life the whole time. It is a little unsettling, like finding an old fingerprint under fresh paint. The Sumerians knew how to count in a way that made the heavens easier to manage. That alone should make us pause. Their mathematics was not decorative. It entered trade, building, agriculture, astronomy, and ritual. The same civilization that raised temple platforms from the plain also raised abstractions in the mind. The people who tracked barley and beer rations also tracked celestial motion. They understood the year with surprising closeness. They noticed patterns that require patience far longer than one generation usually grants. Some scholars argue that later Babylonian and Assyrian tradition refined these observations over centuries, and that is fair to say. But even allowing for that, the roots go deep into Sumer. Now let us move into the Scribal house, because that is where so much of this quiet mystery dries into permanence. The room is cooler than outside. Reed styluses rest beside damp clay tablets. Light comes in gently. A young apprentice bends over a practice text, pressing wedge shapes into the surface with that familiar mixture of boredom, focus, and fear of getting it wrong. His teacher sits nearby, patient in the stern way of people who know they are holding back the flood of forgetfulness. A tablet is not just an object here. It is a trap for time. Press the sign well enough, and a thought can outlive its speaker by thousands of years. That is what happened. They trapped their world in clay, and because of that, we are still sitting with them. The king list is one of those clay traps, and it remains one of the strangest. It lays out rulers before the flood and after the flood. The earliest kings reign for spans so vast that they seem less like men and more like weather patterns. Alolim. Alalgar, Enmenluana, Dumuzid the shepherd. Names crossing the clay in orderly lines, while the numbers behind them stretch absurdly beyond ordinary human life. Tens of thousands of years. Not once, not as a joke, but repeatedly, across versions copied in different places. Naturally, reasonable people step in and say that these numbers are symbolic. Sacred exaggeration. Royal ideology. Numerical theology. A way of announcing immense authority rather than literal time. And perhaps they are right. It is debated. We cannot be sure. But symbolic numbers still have meaning, and the meaning here is not modest. The text wants you to understand that the first age of rule belonged to beings or figures who stood at an impossible distance from ordinary humanity. The age before the flood was not normal. That much the tablets insist upon. And then the flood comes. You can almost hear the shift in tone. The great severing. The world before and the world after. Sumerian memory, like many old memory systems, does not imagine history as one unbroken road. It imagines a break. After the flood, kingship descends again. Cities rise again. But something has changed. The numbers shrink. The scale narrows. Humanity feels smaller in the record, as if some earlier closeness to the divine or the impossible has been lost. That is one of the softest and darkest feelings in these texts. Not doom exactly. Loss. The names of the great gods move through this silence. Anu, above. Enlil in command of air, authority, and decree. Enki, or E, the subtle one of wisdom and hidden waters. Inanna, bright and dangerous. Nana of the moon. Utu of the sun and justice. The divine world is not abstract in the way later theology can become abstract. It is administrative, domestic, political, temperamental. The gods issue judgments, distribute powers, maintain cities, receive offerings, and intervene with unnerving practicality. Among them stand the Anunnaki, that layered and enduring term that later readers have never stopped circling. The offspring of Anu, some say, the princely divine ones, those associated with heaven and earth, those who descended. Depending on text and period, the Anunnaki can appear as a council, a high order, a collective force of divine administration. But what remains steady is their closeness to the structure of civilization itself. They are tied to rule, fate, cosmic arrangement, temple authority, the management of worlds. And that is where the story begins to breathe more coldly, because in the old records, civilization is not only invented by humans, it is granted, structured, handed down, supervised. The Eridu Genesis tells this with extraordinary calm. The gods plan the land. They establish the first cities. They teach what is needed for settled life. Agriculture, herding, craft, order. In this memory, people do not slowly discover the arts of civilization through 1,000 accidental improvements. Instead, civilization feels like an installation, a deliberate setting in place. This city here, this ritual here, This king here, this knowledge here, it is almost bureaucratic in its precision, which is somehow more eerie than if it were wild. And there is another element that makes the room grow a little quieter. The divine beings in these stories do not always sound distant and perfect. They argue. They disagree. They withdraw. They show preference. They plan, punish, warn, and sometimes regret. The old flood traditions, especially in the Atrahasis and in the later flood account carried into the Epic of Gilgamesh, give us a divine council capable of conflict. One god wants destruction. Another whispers warning. One chooses severity. Another chooses preservation. The result is not a neat heaven. It is a governing body with tension inside it. That detail matters, because it makes the old world feel less like poetry and more like remembered administration. By now, the afternoon light has begun to lower across the river plain. Workers move more slowly. The heat lingers in the walls. In the temple court, a priest lifts a bowl, and the smoke from incense threads upward in a straight gray line, as if even the air has agreed to obey. Behind him, in some protected room, tablets are stacked, dried, catalogued, memories becoming architecture. Thought is being shelved. Because the Sumerians were not merely dreamers, they were organizers. They organized land, water, time, rank, labor, offerings, writing. The sky itself, in a sense, if there had been only myths, we might have smiled and moved on. If there had been only engineering, we might have admired and moved on. But the deep fascination of Sumer is that both things stand together. Exact calculations and impossible memories. Drainage systems and kings who reign for ages. Meticulous records and lines about heaven descending into rule. It creates a texture that is hard to dismiss and hard to settle. As evening comes, let us end this first slow walk in Uruk, because Uruk is where the city becomes fully itself. The white temple rises on its platform. Steps lift worshippers away from the plain. Storerooms breathe grain dust. Courtyards carry the noise of sandals, baskets, animals, instructions, songs. Somewhere nearby, a scribe copies a list. Somewhere else, someone marks a shipment of metal. Bronze ratios matter. Tool shapes matter. Records matter. A city of this kind does not run on wonder alone. It runs on information. And still, beneath the efficient pulse of all this order, there is that older pulse, that older claim. We were taught. We were arranged. The first pattern was not ours alone. Some scholars would tell you this is simply how ancient peoples understood legitimacy. Rule comes from heaven because heaven is where authority belongs. Fair enough. Others would point to the startling continuity of the language, the technological jump, and the absence of clear developmental stages, and say the old memory may preserve some distorted record of contact with a source of knowledge that felt non-human, or at least not entirely ordinary. I am not going to force the door one way or the other tonight. Honestly, the doorway itself is interesting enough. What matters for now is that the Sumerians believed civilization had a sponsor, and sponsors, unlike abstract forces, can depart. So, as the temple shadows grow long and the river darkens into bronze, hold on to that thought gently. The first cities rose with a confidence that still unsettles us. Their kings remembered a heaven touched to earth. Their scribes wrote down warnings in the same hands that wrote grain tallies. Their mathematicians measured cycles larger than a single human life. And somewhere in the space between practical record and sacred memory, a question settled over the mud-brick world. What happens to a civilization that was taught from above, when what taught it begins to withdraw? That is where the deeper hush begins, and where we will go next, into the divine order itself, into the names, the councils, the astronomical pathways, and the long, strange memory of beings who did not seem to belong entirely to Earth. Night has settled more deeply over the river plain now. The last light has gone from the upper walls of the temple. Oil lamps hold small, steady flames in protected rooms. Outside, the canals move like strips of dark metal. Inside, the scribes keep working. Even when the city sleeps, someone is still pressing memory into clay. So let us move closer to the names themselves. Anu first, because the sky has to begin somewhere. High, remote, immense. In the oldest arrangements of power, Anu is less a wandering character than a principle of height, authority, and origin. If kingship descends from heaven, then heaven must have an address, and in these texts, that address is linked to Anu. Below him stands Enlil, the force of command, wind, decree, and terrestrial rule. Then Enki, or E, quiet and dangerous in a different way, lord of deep waters, craft, secret knowledge, and subtle rescue. Around and beneath this high structure move the broader ranks of the divine assembly. The Anunnaki, a council in many passages, a category in others, a collective power with specific duties. They are associated with decrees, with fate, with sacred rank, with the structure of civilization itself. They are named in hymns, invoked in legal language, given offerings in temples, linked to heavenly motion, and remembered as if their absence had to be managed with care. That is one of the details I cannot shake. They are remembered not as decorative mythology, but as administrative loss. The old texts often make the divine world feel uncomfortably physical. Food is presented. Garments are listed. Temples are maintained as residences fit for beings of rank. Workshop records, offering accounts, ritual schedules. All of it suggests that the presence of the gods, however we interpret it, was woven into practical systems. This is not a misty religion where heaven floats somewhere politely above daily life. It is more intimate than that, more logistical, more expensive. Whole economies bend around divine service. The old epics carry this same texture in a grander register. In the Atrahasis story, humanity is made within the logic of labor and burden. The gods need relief from toil. Humans are fashioned to work, to bear weight, to keep the system operating. It is a hard little memory, and not one that flatters us. The human place in this account is functional before it is poetic. Then comes the noise of humanity, The crowding, the disturbance, the decision to reduce what was made. These flood accounts are famous now, so familiar that they can lose their chill. But if you slow them down, they become strange again. A divine council debates destruction. One part of the order leans toward erasure. Another part preserves by whispering a warning to a chosen human. Build, seal, measure, waterproof, store. Wait, the instructions are technical. That is what makes them feel so cold. A truly mythic tale might have said only that a righteous man was saved by miracle. The Mesopotamian version likes dimensions, materials, procedures. It likes bitumen. It likes proportional design. It likes the practical intelligence of survival. The chosen man does not merely pray. He constructs. This is a recurring mood in Sumerian and Babylonian memory. When the divine touches the human world, it often does so through knowledge transfer. How to build, how to count, how to observe, how to preserve. That is where the Anunnaki become more than names in a hymn. They become the imagined source of civilizational technique. The old stories do not only say that the gods ruled. They say, in effect, that the gods taught the arts of kingship, priesthood, weaving, music, craft, measurement. Even the hidden ordinances of social life are gathered in the idea of divine distribution. Enki, in particular, is keeper of the deep principles that govern civilization. The old imagination treats city life almost like a stored operating system. Offices, ritual patterns, sacred skills, social forms, things that can be held, transferred, stolen, bestowed. And because it is beautiful, it is also frightening. Anything handed down can be withheld. Anything distributed can be recalled. That is the bridge we now have to cross. Because the old literature does not only remember descent, it remembers departure. The laments come later, and they come in a different voice. Less confident, more broken. The cities that once rang with offerings begin to speak like abandoned houses. Nippur mourns. Mourns. Sumer itself is imagined as weeping through the mouths of its poets. The good day has been carried off. The order has been lifted away. Temples stand, but something in them has gone quiet. The lament for is especially painful because it does not describe simple military defeat, even when warfare is part of the landscape. It describes cosmic abandonment. The patron gods leave. The protective presence lifts. The city is not merely conquered. It is exposed. A city can survive damaged walls more easily than it can survive the feeling that heaven has changed its address. Archaeology, in its own dry way, sometimes stands beside these laments with a very quiet nod. There are places where temple activity does appear to end abruptly. There are construction phases interrupted. There are objects left in ways that suggest not a gentle fading, but rupture. Of course, wars, political collapse, trade failures, drought, and invasion can do terrible things without any help from heaven. We should say that plainly. But the ancient interpretation of collapse matters. 2. These people did not believe they were simply living through one more bad century. They believed a relationship had been broken. That belief shapes everything that follows. Because after direct presence comes substitution. When the gods no longer walk the city plainly, the city becomes obsessed with signs. Omens, astronomy, ritual correctness, divination. If immediate access is lost, then indirect access must be perfected. It is as if Mesopotamian civilization spends centuries learning to live with reduced contact, developing whole sciences of interpretation to compensate for the quiet. This is where the sky grows darker and more intricate. The omen literature, the astronomical series, the ephemeris traditions, all of this becomes a kind of disciplined listening. Jupiter moves, Venus vanishes and returns. Eclipses bite the moon. Mars burns in a certain region of the heavens. A configuration appears, and the scribes ask not merely what it is, but what it means for kings, crops, war, plague, and sacred favor. You can feel the old logic underneath. The heavens are not decoration. They are communication. The stars do not simply shine. They indicate. The best known of these great interpretive bodies track celestial events with patience so disciplined that it still startles modern readers. Planetary cycles are recorded. Visibility periods are noted. Eclipses are predicted. Calendars are adjusted. The system is mathematical, sober, cumulative. It does not feel like superstition carelessly drifting. It feels like a civilization trying very hard not to miss a message. And perhaps, beneath that effort, there is a more painful fear. What if the message is that they are coming back? This is where the prophetic traditions begin to matter, and where the tone of the story changes again. The Marduk prophecy, the dynastic prophecies, Omens series, apocalyptic patterns embedded in later literature. All of these preserve the idea that divine absence is not final. It is cyclical, conditional, timed. The god departs, but the god also has a path back. The city falls, but the city may be made ready again. Human history does not move in a straight line away from heaven. It turns in circles, and some circles close. If you were a Babylonian scribe living with this idea, you would not read the sky casually. You would read it like a shoreline watched for sails. The prophecies often describe periods of abandonment marked by disorder, political upheaval, and environmental trouble, failing rituals, or foreign domination. Then they attach heavenly markers to the eventual reversal. Particular alignments, significant celestial cycles, repeated intervals. The return is not random. It belongs to a schedule. Now, whether that schedule should be understood as sacred patterning, royal ideology, astrological theology, or something more literal, is exactly where the debate begins to boil. Some later interpreters, especially modern alternative readers, saw in this material a direct warning about a future physical return of advanced beings, often linked to Nibiru and long orbital cycles. Mainstream scholarship rejects that leap very strongly, and often for good textual reasons. But even if we remain cautious, the ancient material still leaves us with something unsettling enough. Mesopotamian civilization expected history to be interrupted from above. That expectation sits in the texts like a coal that never fully cools. Let us take Nibiru carefully, because it has become a noisy word in modern hands. And tonight we are trying to move softly. In ancient material, the term is complex, shifting, and context-dependent. It can designate a crossing point, a celestial station, at times an important heavenly body connected with divine authority and ordered motion. Many Assyriologists argue that the modern planet return narrative stretches the evidence too far. That is important, but the deeper mood remains. Mesopotamian astronomy linked divine governance with cyclical heavenly recurrence. Something returns. Something crosses. Something completes its course and alters conditions below, even without sensationalism. That is a powerful image. And the ancients did not separate it neatly from politics. Certain rulers imagined themselves as restorers, preparing the ground for renewed divine favor. Temples were rebuilt to exacting plans. Processional ways were enlarged. Gates were adorned. Sacred architecture became expectation cast into brick and glazed tile. It was not enough to remember the old order. One had to make room for it. I always find that detail almost heartbreaking. Rebuilding not just for present need, but for the possibility that someone absent might one day come home. At Babylon, this hope becomes architectural theater. Massive ceremonial spaces, processions, restored sanctuaries, mathematical alignment in walls and gates. The city itself becomes an invitation, or perhaps a plea. The Akitu festival renews cosmic order year after year, not merely as pageantry, but as maintenance. If heaven has grown quiet, the city will keep the appointment anyway. There is dignity in that. There is also desperation. In the observatory court, a priest-scholar lifts his gaze to the stars with the stillness of a man who has been taught that the sky contains memory. He knows where Jupiter should be. He knows how Venus behaves. He knows what eclipse season means. He also knows that all this knowledge has been preserved through generations of men who believed themselves to be living after a departure and possibly before a return. Imagine the weight of that inheritance. Every tablet copied is more than scholarship. It is vigilance. Every number checked is loyalty. Every omen interpreted is a hand held up against cosmic silence. The most haunting part of the later Mesopotamian imagination may be this very mixture of resignation and preparation. On one hand, the old direct age is gone. The gods no longer live in the city as they once did, at least not in the old remembered way. On the other hand, the city refuses to act as though the relationship is over. It studies, repairs, recites, measures, watches. Civilizations can endure on that kind of waiting for a very long time. And then, time itself becomes part of the theology. Great cycles, great years, long periods folded into celestial mathematics. Human generations become brief little flickers inside these grand revolutions. The scribes know that no one man will see the whole pattern. He copies anyway. He teaches anyway. He leaves the next tablet for someone not yet born. That might be the most moving thing in this entire tradition. Not the grandeur, not the mystery, the patience. The warning survives because generations choose to preserve it. And what is the warning? In its simplest old form, perhaps this: civilizations do not own the order that sustains them. They borrow it. They participate in it. They may even forget its source and mistake maintenance for possession. But the structure above them remains larger than their confidence. If the divine order withdraws, cities weaken. If the celestial pattern shifts, kings lose certainty. If humanity grows loud, arrogant, careless, or misaligned, the bond frays. That is the ancient fear. Not merely that gods are powerful, but that order itself can step back and leave humans alone with their own noise. By the late night hour, the lamplight inside the scribal room is low and honey-colored. The clay tablets cast soft, block-like shadows. One apprentice has fallen asleep against the wall. Another still copies an omen line with aching concentration. Outside, the stars wheel in their ancient silence above the riverlands. Unconcerned, exact, glittering beyond pity. And yet the men below insist on meaning. They always did. That is why the story lasts. The records describe old divine councils, ancient teachings, a flood that broke the first age, temples that housed more than symbolism, a withdrawal that darkened cities, and a future set of conditions under which the ancient powers might again become active in the human sphere. Later ages reinterpret all this, argue over it, sensationalize it, or dismiss it. But if you strip away the modern noise and sit very quietly with the old clay, something steady remains. The first cities believed they had been organized from above. They believed that organization had weakened. They believed the heavens still carried the timetable. And they believed wise people should keep watch. That is where I want to leave you tonight, at the threshold between memory and omen. The lamps are low. The reed stylus is set down at last. The river breathes in the dark. Far above, the measured lights continue their old, indifferent motion. Below them, in a mud brick room, a final tablet dries, with its warning pressed cleanly into the clay. Not panic, not spectacle, only this. Remember the pattern. Watch the sky. And do not assume that absence means the story is over. The night in Babylon feels different from the night in Old Sumer, though the river still carries the same dark shine and the same patient smell of wet earth. The city is larger now, heavier with empire, richer in brick, archive, ceremony, and ambition. Yet beneath all that splendor lies the same old uneasiness. A civilization that once believed the gods walked close now survives on records, calculations, rituals, and waiting. You can feel that waiting most clearly in the prophetic tablets. Imagine a chamber in a royal library, shelves lined with clay, the air dry and powdery, lamp smoke curling upward in thin gray ribbons. Scribes move softly. Nothing here is casual. Each tablet is wrapped in care, copied in order, placed among older voices that refuse to stay silent. One text speaks of Marduk leaving his city. Another speaks of return. Another tracks stars so patiently that the whole sky begins to feel less like a ceiling and more like a schedule. That is the strange calm of Mesopotamian prophecy. It does not usually shout. It measures. The Marduk prophecy is a good place to linger, because it carries the mood of absence and return with an almost ceremonial steadiness. The god leaves. The city suffers. Foreign powers dominate. The order shakes. Yet the text does not stop there. It builds a rhythm. Departure is not random, and neither is restoration. The divine movement follows conditions, sequences, recognizable turns in both politics and heaven. This matters more than it first appears to. If the old texts had simply said that the gods might return one day, then the idea would remain soft and almost harmless, a kind of pious wish. But they do not leave it there. They tie return to signs, specific arrangements, cycles, times of upheaval, celestial markers. In other words, they convert longing into observation. They tell the reader not merely to hope, but to watch. That transforms religion into vigilance. And Babylon was very good at vigilance. Its astronomer priests watched Jupiter, Venus, Saturn, Mars, the moon, eclipse patterns, seasonal shifts, conjunctions, disappearances, reappearances. They were not dabbling. They were maintaining one of the most disciplined habits of celestial attention in the ancient world. Their records were cumulative. One generation copied the observations of the last, then added its own. The sky became a ledger, and the ledger became a means of surviving divine silence. You know that feeling when someone stops speaking to you, and you begin studying every tiny sign for meaning, every pause, every glance, every odd little change in routine. The Mesopotamian cities seem to have done something like that with heaven itself. And so the prophecies breathe through the astronomical material. A certain planetary pattern is no longer just a pattern. It becomes an omen. A strange sequence of eclipses is no longer merely a curiosity. It becomes a warning. A rare conjunction becomes the time of decision. The sky is treated as a legal document written in moving light. Some scholars argue, very sensibly, that this is simply how ancient astrology worked. The heavens mirrored earthly affairs because ancient people believed cosmos and kingdom belonged to one woven order. That explanation is fair, and in many ways it is enough. But even with that said, there remains a chilling intimacy in these texts. They do not read as if the universe is vaguely symbolic. They read as if the universe is administrative. When a sign appears, something will answer to it. The dynastic prophecies intensify this mood by tying cosmic cycles to rulers. Certain kings are expected. Certain bloodlines are watched. Certain restorations become possible only when human authority aligns again with old divine requirements. The future ruler in these texts is not just a good man. He is a fitted man, a vessel, a prepared point of contact between the earthly and the higher order. That idea can sound grand in a temple hymn, but in a quiet room it becomes something else. It suggests that history is not entirely open. It suggests there are roles waiting to be filled, patterns waiting for the proper human shape. The ruler is not inventing destiny. He is stepping into a slot already carved. There is something almost architectural about it. And speaking of architecture, Babylon keeps trying to build its way back into favor. The grand reconstruction projects of later kings take on a different emotional color when you read them beside the prophecies. The Ishtar Gate gleams. The processional way stretches with deliberate magnificence. Temples are widened, heightened, refined. Chambers are laid out according to sacred ratios. Certain spaces are prepared with a care that seems to exceed ordinary devotion. It is as though the city is not merely honoring a god, but making practical arrangements for an arrival. Honestly, that detail lingers in the mind. A civilization can build monuments for glory, memory, pride, fear, or control. But to build in expectation of return, that is a different tenderness, a different dread. The threshold is swept. The room is prepared. The city says, in brick and glaze, if you come again, there will be a place for you. And still the sky must confirm it. The Omens series, known in later tradition as Enuma Anu Enlil, turns the heavens into a system of warnings so elaborate that it almost feels like a machine for reading tension. Tablet after tablet assigns consequence to celestial behavior. If the moon darkens in this month, the king is threatened. If Venus appears in that quarter, foreign powers stir. If Jupiter stands in a certain relation, judgment approaches. The logic is repetitive, detailed, relentless. This is not the mind of a people drifting through superstition without method. This is the mind of a people refusing to let the world become meaningless. And behind all of it is the older memory, the Anunnaki, the council, the decrees, the age when instruction came more directly. One of the more unnerving aspects of the later literature is how often it frames the future in terms of restoration rather than novelty. The return of order is not imagined as a new world, but as an old one coming back into force. Ancient rites, ancient powers, ancient measures, ancient oversight. Human beings are not always described as rising upward into independence. Sometimes they are described as drifting and then being corrected. That is not the kind of progress story modern people usually prefer. We like an arrow. The Mesopotamian imagination often preferred a wheel, and a wheel comes back around. Now let us move for a moment from the grand texts to the human body of the watcher, because the prophecies only remain alive if somebody stays awake long enough to read the signs. Picture the priest-scholar on the roof platform at the edge of night. The bricks are cooling beneath his sandals. His robe shifts lightly in the river wind. Far below, the city hum has grown softer. Dogs bark at intervals. Somewhere a child cries and is comforted. Somewhere a kiln still burns. Above him, the stars are frighteningly exact. He knows what is expected of him. Not certainty, perhaps, but readiness. He marks the hour. He notes the angle. He watches for the appearance of a planet at the edge of dawn. A movement in the sky seems gentle from below, but calculation reveals its strictness. Return after absence. Disappearance after return. Brightening. Dimming. Crossing. Delay. Completion. There is no room for lazy attention here. The gods, if they still communicate through ordered motion, require disciplined eyes. That is how cosmic fear becomes scholarship. And perhaps that is one reason the old records remain so compelling. They make attention feel sacred. The late Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian material deepens the warning. Some texts describe a time when political disorder, environmental imbalance, and celestial irregularity will converge. This convergence does not simply mean hardship. It means transition. The old contracts between heaven and earth are being revised, tested, or reopened. A city living through famine, invasion, and eclipse at once does not experience those events separately. It experiences them as layered signals. The world is out of tune. And if the world is out of tune, something larger may be preparing to intervene. There is a certain mercy in the rituals that accompany this fear. Incantations are copied. Purifications are performed. Temple spaces are washed, fumigated, reoriented. Protective procedures multiply. Human beings do what human beings always do when facing the possibility of forces beyond their scale. They clean. They repeat. They arrange. They hope that correctness may soften impact. I find that deeply human and a little heartbreaking, because if the Anunnaki return in the old sense, then no amount of small human tidiness can place us on equal footing. The rites are not about control. They are about posture, about being found in order rather than in negligence. The incantation texts sometimes describe protective boundaries, ritual circles, spoken formulas, geometric arrangements meant to shield a city or household from destructive aspects of divine contact. Whether these are symbolic, psychological, liturgical, or rooted in lost technical ideas is hard to say. It is debated, but the emotional truth is clear. Return is not imagined as simple comfort. It is dangerous. Too much divine proximity can burn, shake, reorder, expose. The old gods are not cozy. They are organizing forces. And organizing forces do not ask every brick how it feels before they reset the wall. By now, the night has gone deep. The watcher on the roof has marked enough observations to fill a small tablet. He descends carefully, one hand brushing the rough wall for balance, lamp in the other hand, flame making the stairwell breathe with moving light. In the archive chamber below, another scholar receives the notes. They compare them with older records. A pattern emerges, or perhaps it almost emerges. That is often enough to make the room quieter. A conjunction has repeated. An interval has closed. A predicted sign has appeared close enough to matter. And so a line from a much older prophecy is copied once again. Not because panic has won, but because memory must stay ahead of surprise. This is what I want you to feel in this part of the story. Not loud apocalyptic thunder, but the steady tightening of an old pattern. The cities of Mesopotamia did not only preserve myths of divine origins, they preserved procedures for recognizing divine re-entry. They built calendars around it, watched planets for it, modified rituals because of it, rebuilt ceremonial architecture in anticipation of it, and copied warnings across centuries as though the future had already left traces in the sky. That is a very different kind of civilization than one merely amusing itself with fancy legends. It is a civilization trained to expect recurrence. And recurrence changes how people inhabit time. If you think the past is past, you relax into chronology. If you think the past is cyclical, scheduled, and capable of stepping back into the room, you behave differently. You preserve more. You observe more. You distrust random comfort. You keep sacred mathematics alive because one day it may be needed again. As the lamp burns lower, one last thing becomes clear. The warning is not only about gods. It is also about human forgetfulness. The texts keep insisting on memory, on continuity, on exact copying, on celestial literacy, on the preservation of measures and names. Why? Because when great cycles turn, the unprepared are not merely frightened. They are unreadable to themselves. They do not know where they stand inside the pattern. The Mesopotamian answer to that danger was simple and exhausting. Study. Record. Watch. Endure. And perhaps, if the heavens begin to speak more loudly again, do not be among those who mistake the old signs for new accidents. So let the city rest now. Let Babylon dim around its courtyards and terraces. Let the processional stones hold the last warmth of the day. Let the watcher finish his notes. Let the temple door close with a soft wooden thud. Overhead, the planets continue in their long, obedient paths, beautiful and unconcerned. Below, the human world folds itself into sleep, but not completely. Not while the signs remain unfinished. Because in the old clay memory of Mesopotamia, the return was never a fantasy. It was a timing problem. And timing, to people who live by rivers, stars, and records, is never a small thing. We will go further next, into the great cycles themselves, into the mathematics of waiting, into Nibiru, prophecy, pre-flood memory, and the uneasy modern feeling that some of those ancient countdowns were not written only for the dead. Now we have reached the part of the story where time itself starts to feel a little less friendly. The ordinary human way of feeling time is short and bodily. Morning to evening. Seed time to harvest. Youth to old age. Debt due next month. Rain needed by the end of the week. But the Mesopotamian records keep leaning toward another scale. One that can make a human life feel like a moth crossing a courtyard lamp. Great cycles. Long returns. Astronomical ages. Intervals so large that only institutions, not individuals, can really hold them. This is where the old warnings become colder. Because once you begin to think in cycles of centuries and millennia, absence is no longer comforting. It is merely one phase of a pattern, the sexagesimal system, that elegant base 60 inheritance that still sits invisibly inside the modern clock, was more than a handy arithmetic trick. It gave Mesopotamian observers a way to organize celestial repetition with extraordinary flexibility. Fractions behaved cleanly. Angles behaved cleanly. Time itself became something that could be broken, projected, reconciled. With enough patience, the heavens could be turned into long equations, and once the heavens become equations, prophecy begins to sound less like ecstasy and more like bookkeeping. The scribes of Mesopotamia were not staring up in helpless wonder every night. They were comparing tables. They were refining intervals. They were testing whether an eclipse family repeated when expected, whether a conjunction closed on schedule, whether planetary pathways maintained the old ratios. To live inside this kind of knowledge is to feel that the sky may be ancient, but it is not vague. It keeps appointments. This is one reason later readers became fascinated by the idea of Nibiru. In the modern imagination, the word has become loud, inflated, almost theatrical, dragged through every corridor of apocalypse until it rattles. But in the old atmosphere, if we handle it carefully, the unease comes from something quieter, a crossing point, a significant celestial body or station, a sign that what seems far away may eventually cut across the human field again. Some later interpreters, especially in modern alternative traditions, treated Nibiru as a literal returning world with a long elliptical cycle, a body whose approach would signal the return of the Anunnaki themselves. Mainstream scholarship is deeply skeptical of that reading, and rightly points out textual complexity. But even if we set the sensational versions aside, the emotional shape remains. Ancient Mesopotamian thought allowed for the possibility that certain celestial recurrences were not decorative. They mattered. They belonged to turning points. And turning points are never comfortable places to stand. There is a certain number that floats through this discussion with almost hypnotic persistence. 3,600. The Tsar. A great cycle. A completed round associated in later readings with the return of a significant celestial body and the reopening of old conditions. Whether we take that literally, symbolically, or somewhere in between, it reveals something important about the ancient imagination. The world was not thought to drift aimlessly. It moved through measured returns. You know that feeling when an old family story comes back after many years, and suddenly everyone in the room realizes it was never really gone. It was waiting for the right circumstance to become relevant again. That is what these giant cycles feel like in the Mesopotamian material. Dormant relevance. The great year deepens this mood still further. The slow precessional drift of the heavens, the almost imperceptible movement of the equinoctial point through the zodiac, creates a scale of time so patient that it can humble almost any political confidence. Kingdoms rise and vanish. Walls crack. Languages bend. Dynasties become dust. Yet the sky continues its subtle turning. Ancient Mesopotamian calculations of these long rhythms, or at least later traditions that claimed access to them, create the sense that history is nested inside larger celestial revolutions. And if history is nested, then human forgetting becomes dangerous. Because the pattern does not stop merely because one age stops teaching it well. This is the most unsettling gift the old astronomical material offers. It makes ignorance feel local, temporary, almost childish. The heavens go on regardless. The cycle closes whether the village remembers it or not. The gods, if they still belong to the pattern, need not rush. The long mathematics is patient enough to outwait empires. That is why the old warnings preserve knowledge rather than excitement. They do not say, or not usually, be thrilled. They say, be ready. Read the signs. Keep the numbers. Do not lose the tables. Do not let the sequence die. By now, the human figure inside the story has become very small. A single priest on a roof. A single scholar in an archive, a single king rebuilding a gate, all of them working against a scale of recurrence so immense that their own names may end before the cycle has even warmed its edges. Yet this smallness does not produce despair. Not entirely. It produces discipline. If you cannot live long enough to see the whole pattern, then you build institutions that can. Temple schools, archives, astronomical handbooks, ritual calendars, genealogies, architectural ratios, prophetic recensions copied again and again. Each one says, in its own practical voice, we may not survive forever, but the pattern must. And that brings us, gently and perhaps uncomfortably, toward the present. Because the peculiar power of these ancient materials lies partly in how easily modern anxiety can drape itself over them. We live in a time of algorithms, orbital calculations, infrared surveys, climate models, artificial intelligence, gene editing, and deep space speculation. We are, in our own way, another civilization measuring the sky and whispering that the old certainties may not be stable. So when people turn back to Sumerian records and find talk of returning powers, cyclical interventions, advanced knowledge descending from above, and celestial timing tied to upheaval, something in the modern mind immediately stiffens. Not because the ancient texts prove the modern fear, but because they rhyme with it. It is remarkable how often that rhyme appears. Ancient prophecies describe environmental disturbance before major transitions. We talk about climate disruption, rising seas, unstable weather, failing harvests, bitter waters. Ancient systems preserve warnings about political disorder, fractured authority, and social confusion during periods of cosmic significance. We look around and find no shortage of disorder, no shortage of rulers speaking loudly, while certainty grows thinner beneath them. I do not say these things to force a grand conclusion. Quite the opposite. The temptation to overstate is strong, and often silly. History is full of people who think their own age must be the final hinge of the world, and history usually smiles and continues anyway. A little humility is healthy here. Still, humility does not erase the eerie pleasure of correlation. When modern astronomers speculate about a distant, massive object shaping outer orbital behavior, some people hear an echo and whisper, Nibiru, when digital analysis reveals hidden alignments, acoustic geometries, or astronomical sophistication in ancient architecture. Some hear the old claim that advanced knowledge arrived suddenly, rather than gradually, when machine systems now process more information than any one human mind can hold, and gene editing tools begin to touch the structure of life itself. Ancient accounts of beings who fashioned, instructed, and governed humans no longer feel quite as comfortably impossible as they did to an earlier generation. The old divine capabilities have begun to look suspiciously technological, and that is where the story grows more softly dangerous. Because if the ancient texts preserved not literal aliens, not fantasy in the childish sense, but dim cultural memory of contact with a class of intelligence or power experienced as superior, organizing, and not entirely human, then the modern world has reached a strange threshold. We have become advanced enough to imitate some of the old described capacities ourselves. We alter genes. We observe deep space, We build predictive systems. We automate judgment. We search for hidden planets. We map the Earth from orbit. We archive information at scales ancient scribes would have called divine. So the question shifts. Not only are they returning, but also, what kind of creature becomes thinkable when human civilization starts resembling the old descriptions? This is one of those places where the firelight should be low, because the thought is more effective in the half-dark. Imagine an ancient scribe hearing of satellites, gene editing, machine calculation, and planetary probes. He would not understand the engineering, of course, but I suspect he would understand the category. He would say, "These are arts of the higher order. These are the kinds of things one attributes to beings who measure heaven and shape life." And perhaps he would ask whether humans ought to possess them unguarded. That, too, is part of the warning. Ancient Mesopotamian literature does not present high knowledge as morally neutral. It is dangerous in the wrong hands. It must be stewarded. It belongs inside order, ritual, hierarchy, responsibility. When divine and human spheres blur without discipline, catastrophe follows. Flood, collapse, abandonment, broken covenant, disordered kingship, bitter land. In modern terms, we might call this an anxiety about technological power exceeding ethical maturity. The old tablets would simply call it forgetting the terms. There are also the modern heavens themselves, which contribute their own strange hush to the story. Planetary searches, infrared anomalies, orbital clustering in distant icy bodies, deep sky structures, artificial signal searches. Most of this remains ordinary science, doing its patient work, and it should remain that way in our telling. But science, at its edge, can sound almost priestly in tone. A body has not yet been seen directly, only inferred by perturbation. A hidden mass pulls on visible objects. Something unseen leaves a mathematical footprint. If you were standing here with me beside the fire, I think that is the moment when the room would go a little quieter. Because ancient omen culture and modern astrophysics can look unexpectedly alike at a distance. Both read disturbance in the visible field as evidence of an unseen cause. The difference, of course, is method. The modern telescope is not a temple roof, and the modern paper is not an omen tablet. But the human posture of inference is curiously familiar. Something moves what we can see. What, then, is moving it? At the same time, the earth below us grows more unstable in ways that ancient people would have read with immediate symbolic force. Flooding, drought, strange seasons, agricultural stress, fire, political fragmentation, sudden violence around old sacred landscapes. You do not need to force these into prophecy to feel their weight. They are heavy enough already. Yet once you have spent time with Mesopotamian warning literature, it becomes hard not to notice how often transition is described as a convergence. Heavenly signs above, ecological disturbance below, kings confused in the middle. That triad remains hauntingly recognizable. The sky says something. The land answers. Power falters. And then comes the oldest question. Who is still listening? This is why the preservation of ancient material matters so much to the mood of the story. The scribes assumed forgetting was a risk, perhaps the central risk. Not just forgetting gods, but forgetting cycles, forgetting procedures, forgetting how to interpret, forgetting that disorder can be patterned rather than random. Every copied tablet is an act against civilizational amnesia. Our own age has a different kind of memory problem. We preserve too much and understand too little. Data swells. Archives multiply. Signals scream. Yet wisdom often thins inside the noise. Ancient Mesopotamia had less information and far more ritual seriousness about how to receive it. That seriousness may be what modern readers find most unsettling. The possibility that the old people, with all their mythic language and impossible numbers, were at least correct about one thing. That order requires attention, and that losing attention invites correction. By now the fire is lower. The room has grown warmer and dimmer together. Outside, the modern world is still there, with its satellites, servers, telescopes, and storms. But for a little while longer, let us remain with the old clay and its long, patient warning. Civilization may not begin from nothing. Advanced knowledge may not arrive gently. Power that organizes from above may withdraw when conditions fail. The heavens may operate by cycles too vast for ordinary political confidence. And human beings, when confronted with signs, may be tempted to laugh, panic, sensationalize, or forget, when what is actually required is the hardest response of all: to stay awake. That is how I want to end this part. Not with a trumpet, not with an apocalypse, not with an easy claim that the ancient prophecies are now being fulfilled line by line. That is too neat, and the world is rarely kind enough to be neat. Instead, let us end with the image that has followed this whole story from the first city. A watcher, not a conqueror, not a prophet in ecstasy, just a watcher, a person on a high place, keeping a record, comparing cycles, refusing distraction, preserving difficult memory, while everyone else would prefer a simpler story. The old Mesopotamian world survived in part because it trained such people. Perhaps every civilization that hopes to survive its own turning points must do the same in some form. So the watcher remains on the roof. Ancient once, perhaps modern now. Lamp then, screen now. Clay tablet then, model and data set now. But the posture is the same. Look carefully. Measure honestly. Do not flatter the age. And when the pattern begins to close, do not say no one left a warning. We will continue from there next, into the deeper human cost of these warnings, into kings, collapse, hidden knowledge, and the old fear that the greatest danger is not the return itself, but what humanity may have become while waiting for it. The watcher remains on the roof, but below him, the cities are changing. At first, the change is easy to miss. A delayed shipment. A canal needing repair longer than expected. Temple workshops working with older tools because new materials have not arrived. A scribe recopying a damaged tablet and pausing a little too long over a sign that his teacher once knew without effort. Civilization rarely announces its weakening in one grand gesture. More often, it exhales slowly, and the people inside it tell themselves, this is only a difficult season. Babylon, Uruk, Nippur, Sippar, all the old names begin to carry that kind of tiredness in their later layers. The walls still stand. The rituals still proceed. Offerings are still measured. Kings still proclaim favor, victory, restoration. Yet if you look closely, and the old records always ask you to look closely, there is a subtle reduction in confidence. More energy goes into preserving what was than into creating what might be. The city becomes a keeper of inheritance rather than a source of fresh command. That shift matters, because in the old Mesopotamian imagination, divine absence did not simply leave an emotional wound. It changed the quality of human work. Things could still be built, but they were harder to perfect. Laws could still be written, but they grew more elaborate because judgment had become less immediate. Astronomy could still continue, but it now required increasingly careful human maintenance because the heavens were no longer explained by presence, only by pattern. You can feel that burden most clearly in the kings. The earliest rulers in the old lists are not men in the ordinary sense. They belong to the strange dawn world, where kingship descends from heaven and reigns stretch across numbers so large that they stop behaving like biography and begin behaving like atmosphere. Those old kings are less like politicians and more like markers of a cosmic age. They stand inside the flood, divide like pillars in deep water. Then the flood comes, whether as history, myth, memory, or all three braided together. And afterward, kings become smaller, still powerful, still dangerous, still dressed in ritual and authority, but smaller. That reduction is one of the quiet sorrows hidden inside the king lists. Human rule continues, but diminished. Years shorten. Certainty shortens. The ruler no longer feels like an extension of the divine machine. He feels like a manager trying to keep inherited systems from fraying. Honestly, I have always found that detail more haunting than the giant numbers themselves. It is easy to dismiss long reigns as legend. It is harder to dismiss the emotional logic of decline. The old world remembers itself as having once been administered from above with greater coherence, and every later generation compares itself against that lost standard. So each new king arrives under a burden he did not choose. He must restore the city, protect the cult, interpret the signs, preserve the archives, satisfy the gods, secure the canals, calm the land, and somehow prove that he belongs to a line whose original legitimacy came from heaven rather than from force. No wonder so many royal inscriptions sound strained beneath their triumph. Listen closely to them and you can hear the anxiety under the polish. I rebuilt. I restored. I returned the rites. I enlarged the temple. I purified the sacred space. I gathered the old tablets. I honored Marduk. I pleased Ishtar. I realigned the gates. I measured the walls according to ancient design. I made Babylon shine again. Again. That word matters too. Again means the model already existed elsewhere, earlier, fuller. The king is never first. He is corrective. And correction becomes harder when the world itself begins to shake. Flood layers, failed harvests, shifting river paths, collapsing trade networks, invasions from the north, unrest among subject peoples, plagues moving through crowded quarters, local shrines losing revenue, trained craftsmen disappearing faster than they can be replaced. All of this creates the kind of wear that no single ruler can truly reverse. The old prophetic texts seem to understand this. They do not usually imagine collapse as a theatrical punishment alone. They imagine it as the visible effect of losing alignment. Heaven, land, kingship, temple, season, measure, memory, all begin to slip out of tune with one another. The city may still glitter for a while, but the deep geometry is failing. That is when hidden knowledge becomes so important. Because when ordinary administration weakens, the wise response is not merely to shout louder from the palace steps. It is to preserve what can survive the noise. And Mesopotamian civilization was very good at preserving. Picture a chamber beneath a temple foundation. The air is cooler there. Brick sweats faintly in the heat. The lamp flame shortens and steadies because the wind cannot reach so deeply. On shelves, in boxes, in wrapped stacks, lie tablets no longer needed for daily business, but too important to lose. Not market accounts. Not ordinary property disputes. Something else. Mathematical procedures. Astronomical tables. Ritual sequences. Building ratios. Omen series. Names of stars. Instructions for purification. Lineages. Old copies of older copies. What is hidden is not always secret in the romantic sense. Sometimes it is simply too important to leave exposed. Some later texts hint that certain forms of knowledge were deposited beneath temples, as if the building itself were a vault. That image is almost too perfect. The sacred structure standing in sunlight and ceremony above, the technical memory sleeping below, public religion above, buried continuity below. And when invaders come, when the upper rooms burn, when dynasties change their language, when priests flee and kings are dragged down, what then? Then perhaps the chamber waits. Clay waits better than flesh. Geometry waits better than empire. A procedure incised carefully enough can sleep through centuries. This, I think, is one of the most beautiful and eerie aspects of the Mesopotamian world. Its trust in durable record. A human life is brief. A brick city can fall. A god can withdraw. But a well-fired tablet, tucked into dry, dark, and recopied when found, can travel farther than grief. You know that feeling when you find an old note in a book and suddenly the person who wrote it is standing beside you again, even if they have been gone for years. Scale that upward, and you begin to understand what a buried archive means. It is a conversation laid in ambush for the future. No wonder so many later peoples searched ruins for tablets. No wonder libraries became places of power. No wonder conquerors stole scribes when they could. Because whoever controls preserved knowledge controls more than memory. He controls recovery. Let us stay for a moment with one of those recovering moments. The city after sack or flood. The streets are uneven with debris. The smell of wet clay and smoke hangs low. Doors gape open where wood has burned away. In one district, a shrine still stands, blackened but upright. In another, a canal has silted into uselessness. People move carefully, speaking less than usual, lifting broken pieces, searching for grain, for tools, for family, for anything that can be named, saved. And then someone opens a chamber. Inside, there are tablets. Not food, not gold, not blankets. Tablets. To a starving body, that may seem almost insulting for a moment. Clay does not quiet the belly. Yet civilizations are strange creatures. They can live through hunger and still die of forgetting. So the tablets are carried out, dusted, sorted, read if possible, stored again, copied perhaps by hands that have lost half their teachers. In that gesture there is a kind of stubborn faith. We may not rebuild fully today, but we refuse to become illiterate toward what we once knew. That refusal is heroic in the least flashy way imaginable. And it also reveals the deeper fear behind all the Anunnaki warnings. The true disaster is not simply flood or invasion or plague. It is the severing of transmission. The moment when divine patterns, human skill, and stored instruction no longer reach one another. Once that break happens, later generations may inherit structures without knowing how to replicate them. They may keep rituals whose engineering meanings are gone. They may retell myths whose practical origins have slipped beneath symbolic language. They may calculate with fragments of a larger system and not even realize how much has been lost. Some scholars argue that this is precisely what happened over the long span of Mesopotamian history. Knowledge narrowed. Specialized techniques disappeared. Religion became more representational and less operational. The gods remained culturally potent, but their direct, practical relation to building, measuring, governing, and calculating was softened by time. That explanation is sober and plausible. Yet from within the old story, the feeling is harsher. From within the old story, humanity did not simply evolve away from divine administration. Humanity was left with the manuals. And manuals are lonely things without masters. This loneliness can be sensed in the late ritual material. Instructions expand. Steps multiply. Clarifications are added. Corrections are inserted. It is the textual behavior of a civilization compensating for fading immediacy. When a craft is truly alive and constantly transmitted, certain things do not need to be written down in exhausting detail. But when expertise grows fragile, documents thicken. They begin anticipating confusion. That is why the later Omen texts, incantations, and procedural tablets often feel so intensely methodical. Not because the old world became suddenly obsessed with bureaucracy for its own sake, but because procedure was all that stood between continuity and blur. Even the landscapes reflect this mood. Mesopotamia was never a passive setting. Rivers shifted. Levees broke. Salinity crept into fields. Marshes expanded and shrank. Cities had to labor constantly just to remain where they were. Remove strong centralized management for a generation or two, and the land would begin renegotiating human ambition immediately. There is almost a lesson in that. Civilization appears solid when maintained. It reveals its softness when neglected. The same could be said of memory. That is why the old warnings about return do not merely describe celestial signs. They imply readiness in the human sphere. Are the temples aligned? Are the texts preserved? Are the bloodlines known? Are the rites remembered? Are the foundations sound? Are the observers disciplined? Are the rulers just? Are the people still capable of receiving what once made them more than scattered villages beside a dangerous river? And here the story becomes uncomfortably reflective. Because every generation likes to imagine it would welcome higher truth nobly. But would it? Or would it misread it, commercialize it, fragment it, politicize it, sensationalize it, reduce it to faction and spectacle? Ancient Mesopotamian literature often seems doubtful about human maturity. It preserves a low opinion of our consistency. We receive gifts, then distort them. We build systems, then neglect them. We are taught order, then prefer appetite. No wonder the gods withdraw in these stories. Proximity becomes wasteful. This may be why so many return prophecies sound less like promises and more like inspections. A returning power does not come merely to comfort the faithful. It comes to assess what has been done with the inheritance. That is a chilling frame. It means history is an examination hall, and most of us have been whispering instead of studying. By now, the hidden chamber beneath the temple has been resealed. The tablets rest again in dark. Above them, the city stumbles onward. A new ruler is crowned. A wall is rebuilt. A festival is held with diminished splendor but correct sequence. Children learn signs from teachers whose own lessons were interrupted by loss. Traders bring stories from distant roads. An eclipse is predicted and arrives on time. People gasp, pray, note the omen, then continue. This is what survival looks like in the old world. Not purity, not full restoration, just enough continuity to keep the line from snapping. And perhaps that is why the warnings endure so well. They were never written for the perfect age. They were written for the damaged one, for the generation living after some withdrawal, after some flood, after some collapse, after some forgetting. They were written for people who no longer had the gods in the room, but still had the records and the sky. That is a narrower inheritance than direct presence, but it is not nothing. In fact, it may be the most honest inheritance humans ever receive. Not certainty, but traces. Not command, but pattern. Not safety, but enough continuity to recognize a turning point when it begins. So let the kings of the old cities pass before us now in their dim procession. Builders, restorers, boasters, supplicants, canal clearers, archive keepers, temple raisers, omen readers, all of them trying in their own way to hold human society upright beneath a sky that once seemed closer and now feels terribly exact in its distance. Let the hidden tablets remain under brick. Let the flood memory stay in the soil. Let the watchers continue their notations. Let the rites repeat. Let the world above ground believe itself stable for one more season. Below all that, a quieter truth continues. Knowledge survives best when buried, copied, and revered. And when the next disturbance comes, it will not only test the walls and fields, it will test the chain of transmission, In the next part, we will move deeper into that test, into what happens when warnings survive but are misunderstood, when modern people reopen old fears, and when the oldest question rises again from clay and starlight together, not whether the Anunnaki once came, but what kind of world would call them back. By the time a warning survives long enough to reach us, it has already changed shape. That is one of the quiet tragedies of ancient texts. They cross centuries like travelers crossing deserts. Some lose names. Some lose endings. Some arrive, cracked at the corner, or burned along the edge, or recopied by hands that half understood a sign and guessed at the rest. Even when preserved with love, they are never untouched by passage. And so when the old Mesopotamian warnings finally enter the modern room, they do so wearing layers of dust, scholarship, fantasy, hunger, skepticism, projection, and longing. It is no wonder they are misunderstood. The modern world has a peculiar talent for turning difficult inheritances into immediate entertainment. A prophecy becomes a headline. A buried archive becomes a conspiracy. A celestial cycle becomes a countdown clock on a bright screen. The old watcher on the roof becomes, somehow, a man on a channel speaking too quickly over dramatic music. In that transformation, seriousness leaks away, yet not entirely. Because even when misread, some warnings refuse to become harmless. That is why these Mesopotamian materials continue to trouble the imagination. Strip away the loudest claims and what remains? A memory of advanced instruction arriving suddenly. A conviction that civilization did not rise by simple accident. A record of divine withdrawal tied to social and environmental disorder. A corpus of omens and astronomical tables built around recurrence. Prophetic literature that treats return as possible, conditional, and dangerous. A pattern of preserving knowledge underground and in archives against future rupture. That is already enough to unsettle a thoughtful mind. And thoughtful minds in the modern age have approached these materials from every direction. Some come with strict philology and patient grammar, testing signs, variants, and contexts. Some come with archaeology, with soil in the fold of the glove and dates in calibrated ranges. Some come with astronomy, tracing cycles and alignments. Some come with material analysis, asking whether bronze, brick, clays, and stone reveal capacities that the old narratives exaggerate, conceal, or accidentally describe. Some come with alternative visions, seeing extraterrestrials, engineered bloodlines, hidden planets, cosmic intervention. Most of these approaches disagree with one another, but disagreement itself is revealing. No one argues this fiercely over trivial inheritances. Part of the problem is that Mesopotamia sits uncomfortably at the beginning of too many things. Writing, law, city-scale administration, mathematics, systematic astronomy, monumental temple culture. Once a civilization stands at the front of so many queues, people naturally ask where its own line began. If the Sumerian world appears already articulate, already measured, already bureaucratically awake, then what darkness stood immediately before it? What transfer happened? What accumulated in the unseen layers below? The old texts offer one answer. The gods brought order. modern scholarship offers another. Long developments converged, and our evidence for their earlier phases is incomplete. Alternative thinkers offer a third. An advanced intelligence intervened directly. I will say this gently. The third answer often becomes cartoonish in careless hands. Still, the first and second answers do not erase the emotional force of the question itself. Why does early Mesopotamia look so startlingly prepared? Why does its memory so insistently point upward and backward at once? Why do the warnings feel procedural rather than merely poetic? And why, perhaps most unsettling of all, do modern circumstances keep making the old themes feel newly relevant? We live amid acceleration. That alone would make ancient return cycles attractive to the imagination. But it goes deeper than that. Modernity has begun to produce realities that look from a distance, like the old categories. Hidden masses inferred through orbital effects. Artificial intelligence performing acts of calculation that feel superhuman. Gene editing touching the architecture of life. Vast communication systems operating invisibly above our heads. Climate disruption moving from forecast to bodily experience. Archaeological technologies that reveal buried chambers without touching them. Digital tools that reconstruct lost cities from fragments. In another age, many of these things would have been described in divine language. That does not mean the old stories were secretly describing our machines line by line. It means human beings repeatedly reach a threshold where ordinary categories feel too small for what is happening. Mesopotamia used God language. We use scientific language. Both are ways of trying not to blink while describing power. This is where the Anunnaki return warning acquires its modern edge. Perhaps the return is not simply an event in the sky. Perhaps it is also a condition on Earth. A point at which human systems once again approximate the scale of old attributed powers. A point at which the difference between the instructed and the instructors narrows just enough to become unstable. That is a dangerous thought. Because if the old stories are right in spirit, then higher knowledge is never just a gift. It reorders obligation. It makes ethical immaturity more expensive. It magnifies consequences. The flood narratives preserve this lesson clearly. Humans receive civilization, then noise, appetite, disorder, covenant breaking, arrogance, or simple accumulation make continued proximity intolerable. The result is correction through catastrophe and remnant. Now look around a little, not in panic, just in honesty. Do we seem like a species that has become calmer in proportion to its power? Do we appear especially mature in our handling of inherited tools? Are we good custodians of systems we barely understand but use constantly? The old clay might answer with a dry little smile. Mesopotamian warning literature often carries the implication that return is most likely when humanity again reaches a critical threshold of significance and instability together. Not weakness alone, not strength alone, a convergence. We matter enough to be dangerous. We are sophisticated enough to disrupt broad patterns. We are knowledgeable enough to trespass. We are confused enough to do it badly. That combination sounds unnervingly modern. And still, the warnings do not tell us to despair. They tell us to prepare. This is important. Preparation in the old sense does not mean hiding in terror under a table while waiting for the heavens to crack. It means purification, record-keeping, correct orientation, disciplined observation, restoration of right measure, preservation of technical and sacred memory. It means becoming legible to order again. I think that is one reason the stories linger with people who are otherwise not very mystical. Because the practical moral survives, even if one sets aside literal divine return. A civilization in danger must become more exact, not less. It must care for archives, instruments, language, soil, water, transmission, justice, and scale. It must stop confusing noise for authority. It must learn again how to receive difficult truth without instantly turning it into spectacle. Those are not bad instructions for any age. Let us linger now with a scene of rediscovery, because the modern relationship to these warnings is often physical before it is interpretive. A trench opened in Iraq, dust lifting in fine clouds from a newly exposed wall. A workman brushing the edge of a clay tablet with absurd tenderness. The shape emerges. Signs appear. Another voice, very old and somehow intact, re-enters the breathing world. There is magic in that, though I use the word softly. Not the magic of fiction, but the magic of continuity, defeating oblivion by one object at a time. A tablet written when Rome did not exist, buried while languages changed above it, found beneath political ruin, carried to a table, lit under a conservation lamp, read by a scholar in a different alphabet thousands of years later. If that is not a kind of resurrection, it is at least a close cousin. And with resurrection comes risk, because every recovered warning must now survive modern interpretation. Some readers lean too far into dismissal. Myth, they say, and close the case. Others lean too far into literalism and claim every ancient phrase as proof of a preferred fantasy. Between those extremes lies the harder path. To let the text remain strange. To admit that ancient people may have encoded real observations, real disasters, real technical knowledge, and real historical memories inside forms that are neither simple history nor mere invention. That middle path requires patience, and patience is not fashionable. But the Mesopotamian material rewards it. Take the return of hidden knowledge. Ancient texts describe wisdom stored in deep chambers, in foundations, in the custody of lineages and temple institutions. Modern archaeology keeps revealing exactly how much the ground can hold. Underground structures, sealed rooms, buried archives, forgotten installations, preserved calculation systems. Even when nothing supernatural appears, the emotional truth sharpens. Civilizations really do hide their most important things where surface chaos cannot casually erase them. Take celestial warnings. Ancient Omens series linked unusual alignments and eclipse patterns to turning points in rulership and environmental stress. Modern science will not preserve the omen logic in its old theological form, but it does preserve the reality that celestial cycles shape earthly conditions, from seasons and tides to long orbital patterns and solar effects. The ancients were not foolish to watch the sky. They may have been wiser than our fluorescent interiors sometimes allow us to be. Take technological memory. Ancient stories say the gods taught agriculture, measurement, city-making, metallurgy, law. Modern evidence continues to show that core civilizational systems often emerge in tighter clusters and with greater sophistication than simple schoolbook narratives once admitted. That does not prove divine tutors in a crude sense. It does remind us that the rise of complexity is still not fully demystified. And then there is the hardest theme of all: return. What does return even mean in a serious reading of these warnings? A literal descent of ancient beings from a distant celestial origin. A symbolic recurrence of civilizational conditions that once invited higher-order correction. A reactivation of hidden human capacities described in God language by earlier cultures. A contact event through technology rather than temple. A renewed realization that the cosmos contains intelligence indifferent to human vanity. A moment when we rediscover that our ancestors were not primitive in the ways we like to imagine. It may be one of these. It may be several braided together. It may be none in the dramatic sense and all in the structural sense. That uncertainty is not a failure of the story. It is the story. Because warnings are not blueprints. They are thresholds of attention. The old scribes were not trying to hand us a polished modern manual for the 21st century. They were doing something more humane and, in a way, more durable. They were preserving enough pattern that another age, if it grew unstable under similar signs, might feel the old caution stir again. You know that feeling when you step into a room where people have just stopped talking, and even without hearing the earlier conversation, you can tell something serious has been said there. That is what the Mesopotamian warnings feel like across time. We did not hear the first voice directly, but the room still carries it. The room in this case is civilization itself. By now we have moved far from the first city walls and first temple enclosures of Sumer, yet the old questions remain standing. Where did the earliest order come from? Why did it seem so sudden? Why do the records divide history with a flood? Why are the first kings so impossibly large? Why is advanced knowledge treated as inherited rather than invented? Why do later texts preserve the idea that absence is temporary? Why does the future keep getting written as recurrence? These questions do not vanish because we are sophisticated. If anything, sophistication makes them more pointed. A truly modern mind should not fear ancient texts, but neither should it patronize them. That is the balance I want to keep as we move forward. Calm, but not smug. Open, but not gullible. Willing to let the old world remain grander and stranger than our categories prefer. Willing also to say when evidence stops and imagination begins. There is dignity in that restraint. The ancient scribes themselves would likely understand it. They were, after all, people of careful signs and exact numbers, not merely dreamers in the dust. And yet dream they did, in the largest way. Not little private fantasies, but civilizational dreams of order descending, of gods ruling wisely, of hidden knowledge preserved, of a future turning that would reopen contact between Earth and the greater pattern. Whether one reads that as religion, memory, cosmology, coded history, or some combination, it remains an astonishing inheritance. So let us end this part in the present tense of waiting. The tablets are no longer only in buried chambers. Many are catalogued, digitized, translated, argued over. The stars are no longer read only from temple roofs. They are tracked by satellites and observatories. The hidden planet, if it exists, is sought by mathematics before sight. The flood warning is no longer only in myth. It is in climate models, coastlines, insurance maps, and the nervous language of policy. Gene shaping is no longer a divine prerogative in story. It is a laboratory possibility. Machine calculation is no longer a dream of God minds. It is ordinary and expanding. The old categories and the modern ones have begun to cast shadows into one another. That does not prove an ancient prophecy fulfilled. It does something subtler and perhaps more important. It makes the ancient warning legible again. And once a warning becomes legible, responsibility begins. In the next part, we will move toward the final stretch of this long night journey, into the convergence itself, into what the Sumerian records may really be asking of us, and into the last uneasy thought that has haunted this whole story, from the first descending kingship to the last copied omen, that perhaps the real sign of return is not what appears above us, but whether humanity has remembered enough below to meet it without breaking. Now we arrive at the part of the old warning that feels closest to our own breathing. Not the first gift, not the flood, not even the long sorrow of withdrawal. The convergence. Ancient Mesopotamian thought loved patterns that returned by cycle, but it did not imagine repetition as something neat or comforting. A cycle was never a perfect circle. It was more like the river breathing against its banks, familiar and different at once, carrying the memory of earlier water, but not the same water. The old tablets seem to whisper that history behaves in much the same way. Signs gather, measures drift, knowledge rises, pride rises with it. Then the great machinery of consequence begins to move. If you were standing here with me in a museum hall after closing, with the lights dimmed low and the glass cases holding their patient little rectangles of clay, I think you would feel it too. That museum hush, that careful silence, dust sleeping in the seams of old brick, the faint reflection of your own face over a text written by someone who had never heard your language and yet somehow anticipated your unease. Because what these records preserve is not merely a story about strange beings from heaven, or old kings with impossible reigns, or temple astronomers counting stars until their eyes watered in the dark. They preserve a habit of watching for dangerous thresholds. They preserve a conviction that knowledge accumulates faster than wisdom, unless wisdom is guarded on purpose. They preserve the fear that civilization can become technically brilliant and spiritually clumsy at the same time. That fear is modern enough to sting. Look at the list again, gently this time. A world networked by invisible systems. Calculations made faster than ordinary thought. Gene editing. Artificial minds. Climate instability. Cities that glow all night and yet cannot always remember what sustains them. Archives stored in fragile media. Belief systems fragmenting under pressure. Public noise increasing as inner steadiness decreases. People mistaking information for orientation. Rulers mistaking control for legitimacy. Whole populations living at scales so vast that old moral instincts struggle to keep up. You could call all of that contemporary. You could also call it in the deep old Mesopotamian sense, a civilization approaching review. I do not mean that dramatically. I mean it with the quiet seriousness the tablets themselves deserve. The old warning is not simply that the Anunnaki might return in ships or fire or visible celestial pageantry. The old warning is that human civilization might once again become large enough, powerful enough, unstable enough, and strangely forgetful enough to require an answer from beyond its own confidence. Whether that answer comes as literal beings, catastrophic correction, newly revealed knowledge, or the collapse of our illusions about our own centrality, the emotional shape is the same. A threshold is crossed, and thresholds are awkward places. The floor behind you is familiar. The floor ahead is not yet under your full weight. You hesitate there. You become aware of your breathing there. You notice every sound. A footstep in a corridor. The click of cooling metal. Wind slipping under a door. Water far off. Your own pulse, suddenly louder than it should be. This story has that feeling. The Sumerians, and those who copied and reworked their inheritances after them, seem to believe that celestial cycles and human cycles eventually rhyme, not in a childish fortune-telling sense, in a structural sense. Certain arrangements of power, knowledge, pride, disorder, and cosmic timing produce turning points. The sky does not cause everything by simple magic, but it marks the larger clock within which civilizations rise, forget, improvise, overreach, and receive consequences. That is why the astronomical material matters so much. It is not decorative. It is scheduling. The watchers on the temple roofs were not only admiring beauty, they were checking position. They were comparing current motion to inherited expectation. They were asking, with a steadiness I deeply admire, whether the heavens were entering one of those dangerous harmonies again. Imagine one of them now. He stands above Babylon in the dry night, brick still warm under his sandals, the city below him smelling of oil, river damp, animals, smoke, and human density. The stars have emerged one by one. Then all at once, in that desert clarity that makes heaven look less like a ceiling and more like an open wound of light. He has tablets beside him, a lamp, a stylus, years of training in his wrists. He watches a planet lift in the expected sector, but perhaps too bright, or later than expected, or in combination with another sign the Omens series warned must be recorded with care. He notes it, breathes once, notes it again. No panic, just procedure. Honestly, that may be the most admirable part of the whole tradition. Faced with the possibility of divine return, cosmic correction, or civilizational danger, the first response is not screaming. It is measurement. We could learn from that. Modern people are often very good at reacting and strangely poor at observing. We love immediate feeling. We love instant explanation. We love choosing a camp before a pattern has fully emerged. The old Mesopotamian mind, whatever else one says about it, had more patience. It knew that a single sign is only a sign. It becomes warning when it enters sequence. And sequence is what we have been tracing all night. First, advanced civilization appearing with startling force. Then memory of older sources. Then divine descent. Then long kingship. Then flood. Then restored order. Then gradual withdrawal. Then preservation of records. Then prophetic warnings. Then astronomical countdowns. Then later generations trying to restore contact through architecture, ritual, and calculation. Then the warning carried forward like a lamp with a low flame. Not dead, just guarded. And now us. You can almost hear the little unspoken question at the edge of all that material. What kind of generation receives the warning and mistakes itself for the exception? Every generation does, of course. That is part of the comedy and sadness of being human. We always think we are uniquely advanced and uniquely exempt. The old Mesopotamian texts would probably smile at that with great weariness. They had seen city after city imagine permanence. They had watched kings carve certainty into stone, only to become broken names in a layer of rubble. They had seen waters rise and trade collapse, and temples empty and yet still preserve the same essential caution. Scale does not remove vulnerability. Sophistication does not cancel judgment. Being brilliant at making systems does not mean you know why they should exist. There is another detail that lingers with me here. In many of these traditions, return is not automatically good news. That matters more than modern fantasy usually admits. We like the idea of ancient wisdom coming back because we assume it will flatter us, heal us, explain us, maybe even rescue us. But the old records are much less sentimental. Divine return means inspection, reordering, the exposure of false measures, the end of tolerated disorder. It means that what has been hidden becomes visible. It means that self-serving rulers, noisy priesthoods, corrupt calculations, and lazy stewards of inheritance will all be seen in their proper scale. That is not comforting unless you have been living very carefully. You know that feeling when a room has been messy for a long time, and suddenly someone meticulous is coming over. Not someone cruel, just someone who actually notices everything. The dust on the shelf, the cup left under the chair, the paper pile you kept pretending was a system. Multiply that by civilization itself, and you come close to the emotional charge of these return prophecies. The books are not merely asking, will they come back? They are asking, what state will they find us in? This is where the motifs we've carried begin to gather into one place. Dust on clay. River breath moving under moonlight. Candlelight across copied signs. Footsteps in temple corridors. Shrinking numbers in king lists after the flood. Deep time pressing its calm hand on the shoulder of every human boast. A museum hush around what used to be urgent instruction. All of it belongs here, because all of it says the same thing in different accents. Civilization is fragile. Memory is sacred. Pattern matters. The old tablets do not ask us to become superstitious. They ask us to become worthy of inheritance. Maybe that means preserving archives better than we preserve outrage. Maybe it means treating astronomical knowledge and environmental knowledge as civilizational necessities rather than hobbies of specialists. Maybe it means admitting that ancient people were not stupid children waiting for us to explain the world to them. Maybe it means learning that every great system, legal, technical, agricultural, ritual, computational, depends on transmission. And transmission fails when vanity becomes stronger than stewardship. Maybe it means all of those at once. Let me say one more careful thing. I do not know whether literal Anunnaki return will ever step down from some distant orbit into human sight. I cannot promise that, and would not pretend to. Some parts of this tradition belong to mythic language. Some belong to historical memory. Some belong to astronomy. Some belong to the human habit of wrapping difficult truths in God-shaped forms, because gods are sometimes easier to bear than equations. But I do know this. The warning itself is real. The warning that knowledge without reverence becomes dangerous. The warning that political order without moral order becomes hollow. The warning that environmental balance can fail while cities are still bragging. The warning that buried records may outlive the empires that ignored them. The warning that human beings repeatedly inherit gifts they do not fully understand. That warning is real enough. So let the stars keep moving. Let the calculated cycles complete themselves with their patient exactness. Let the theoretical planet remain theoretical a little longer, if it must. Let the climate graphs rise, and the machines learn, and the archives be opened, and the desert keep its old silence around ruined ziggurats. We do not need full certainty to receive the instruction. We only need humility strong enough to recognize an old pattern when it begins closing around us again. The watcher on the roof would understand that. He would not ask for certainty. He would ask whether we are still looking carefully enough to deserve the next sign. And perhaps that is the truest bridge between his age and ours. Not shared technology. Not shared myth. Shared vulnerability beneath a lawful sky. There is one more image I want to leave in this part before we cross into the ending, because it may be the most human image in the whole chain of warning. A child learning to copy signs. Not a king. Not a priest. Not a watcher on the highest roof. Just a child in a schoolroom attached to a temple or a house of tablets, knees dusty, fingers clumsy, trying to impress wedges into wet clay while an older voice corrects posture, sequence, pressure, angle. The room smells of damp earth and reed cuttings. Outside, footsteps pass in the courtyard. Someone carries water. Somewhere farther off, a donkey complains with comic indignation, as donkeys always seem to do, even in the grand shadow of civilization. The child presses the sign badly, scrapes it away, tries again. That moment may matter more than any prophecy, because warning only survives if ordinary discipline survives. The whole magnificent machinery of king lists, astronomical tables, omen series, liturgies, building ratios, all of it depends in the end on small human repetitions done well enough, long enough, by people who will never have statues. A civilization does not remember by accident. It remembers because anonymous hands keep shaping clay while the larger world grows distracted. That is why I do not hear these old records as pure doom. I hear, beneath their caution, a plea for apprenticeship. Learn properly. Measure carefully. Copy faithfully. Look up at the sky. Yes, but also look down at the tablet in your hand and do not let the line break. If our age has an equivalent duty. Perhaps it is this: to stop acting as if information storage alone equals wisdom, to train attention again, to teach the young not merely how to access knowledge, but how to inherit it without dissolving into noise. The Mesopotamian warning becomes gentler when seen through that lens. It is not only about what descends from heaven. It is about whether the earth remains capable of disciplined reception. And if that sounds almost tender, perhaps it should. Because every true archive is an act of love disguised as administration. So the convergence is not only terrifying, it is intimate. It asks whether the chain still holds, whether the next hand is steady, whether the old rooms of learning still produce people patient enough to keep dangerous and beautiful knowledge from becoming either superstition or waste. In that sense, the warning is very near to us indeed, not out beyond Saturn, but in classrooms, libraries, laboratories, observatories, riverbanks, server rooms, excavation trenches, and all the other quiet places where transmission either survives or fails. In the final part, we will let the warning settle all the way into stillness. We will walk once more through the buried cities and their patient records, and we will end not with a shout about what is coming, but with the oldest and quieter question the clay seems to leave in our hands. If return is possible, can a forgetful civilization learn how to receive it without turning the gift into ruin again? So now the hour grows late, and the warning has reached the quietest part of its journey. Not the beginning, where everything was descent and astonishment, not the middle, where cities rose like measured hymns beside the rivers, and the first kings carried heaven inside their titles. Not the breaking point, where floods came, temples emptied, and the gods of the old stories withdrew their visible nearness from the daily machinery of human life. No, this is the last room of the night. The room where the fire burns lower. The room where even questions begin to speak more softly. And in this room, the Mesopotamian warning becomes almost heartbreakingly simple. Remember well enough, or suffer the cost of forgetting. That is really what the whole inheritance circles back toward. The Anunnaki, whether read as divine rulers, culture bearers, advanced beings, celestial intelligences, mythologized memories of lost instruction, or all of these overlapping in difficult ways, matter because they stand at the origin point of ordered gift. They are the story form given to that ancient intuition that human civilization did not feel self-made. It felt received, measured out, handed over with conditions. Agriculture, measure, law, astronomy, writing, city planning, metallurgy, ritual sequence. All of it arrives in the old records under the sign of transmission. Humanity is not the source. Humanity is the steward. That is a noble role, but also a perilous one. Because stewards can become careless. Records can become decorations. Temples can become theaters. Kings can begin loving their own authority more than the pattern that legitimized it. Priests can memorize procedures and forget their point. Scribes can copy signs they no longer feel. Builders can repeat proportions without understanding why certain ratios once mattered. Children can inherit stories that sound like legends and never guess they contain procedural memory from ages of flood and collapse. And then one day a civilization wakes to discover it has been living on interest, not capital, That is the sadness beneath the grandeur of Mesopotamia. It knew itself as late. Even early Sumerian civilization often sounds late when it speaks about itself. Late to a gift already bestowed. Late to a kingship already descended. Late to patterns already established in heaven and merely mirrored on earth. The oldest city already looks backward. The first written records already remember. The first mathematics already assume prior observation. The first laws already imitate an older order. I have always found that astonishing. The so-called beginning of civilization does not sound like a beginning. It sounds like the opening chapter of a story that had already been going on in silence for a very long time. That is why the flood matters so much. Not only as catastrophe, but as divider. Before and after. Fullness and remnant. Presence and preservation. The flood is the great narrowing. It turns an administered world into an inherited one. It turns direct relation into memory work. It turns human beings into curators of fragments. And curators live with pressure. They know the archive is incomplete. They know the copy may contain errors. They know the chamber below the temple may still hold unopened material, while the upper rooms are already crumbling. They know one invasion, one fire, one dynasty change, one failed harvest, one scribe shortage can break a transmission line kept intact for centuries. Imagine that feeling. You are a late Babylonian scholar. The city around you is still immense, but not innocent. Empires press at its edges. Politics has thickened into danger. Priests keep the rights. Yes, but revenues are uneven. The old observations continue, but some of the confidence has gone out of them. You sit in a room with tablets older than your grandfather could imagine. You read prophecies copied from older copies of older signs. Outside, footsteps pass in a corridor. Inside, a lamp flickers. The clay in your hand mentions cycles that point beyond your lifetime. It speaks of return, judgment, celestial alignment, restored order, hidden chambers, bloodlines, obligations, thresholds, and you know, with that private scholar, sorrow no king will ever fully understand, that your task is not to finish the story. Your task is to keep it legible for whoever comes next. That is dignity of a very high kind. No applause, no monument, just exact copying against oblivion. Perhaps that is why the tablets still move us. Because even when one strips away every supernatural reading and leaves only human effort, what remains is beautiful. Generations of people who believed memory mattered enough to bake it into clay, bury it, retrieve it, recopy it, argue over it, arrange it, protect it, and hand it forward through political weather harsher than most modern societies have the courage to imagine. There is tenderness in that. A tenderness stern enough to survive empire. We have walked a long way tonight through their world. Through Uruk and Eridu. Through king lists and flood lines. Through temple roofs where astronomers watched the heavens with disciplined eyes. Through underchambers where preserved knowledge waited in dark. Through laments in which gods depart and cities weep. Through prophecies that refuse to let absence become the final word. Through later ages where scholars, rulers, and dreamers all attempted to understand what kind of return the old warnings promised. Now we stand at the edge of our own century with those clay voices still sounding faintly in the ear. What do they ask of us? Not panic, I think. Not easy belief either. Not the childish thrill of imagining that all complexity must have come from somewhere else because our ancestors could not possibly have been subtle or disciplined or brilliant on their own. That is too small a reading. And not the opposite arrogance either. The smug modern reflex that files all ancient testimony under fantasy the moment it becomes inconvenient to our tidy development charts. No, the clay asks for something harder. Reverent intelligence. The willingness to let the ancient world remain more sophisticated than our stereotypes. The willingness to study without flattening, to doubt without sneering, to wonder without lying. The willingness to preserve what we do not yet fully understand. The willingness to measure our power against our moral preparation and find ourselves, perhaps, less ready than we had hoped. That is the part that keeps the old warning alive. Because if the Anunnaki return is literal, then humility is prudent. If it is symbolic, then humility is still prudent. If it names a recurring civilizational threshold where higher-order truth confronts lower-order vanity, then humility is essential. If it means that human civilization is once again approaching a scale at which forgotten laws of consequence become active, then humility may be the only sane posture left. The old Mesopotamian mind would probably not have admired our confidence very much. It would have admired our exactness, if we had any, our care with records, our seriousness toward timing, our respect for foundations, our understanding that a city is not made safe by noise, our refusal to confuse spectacle with legitimacy, our ability to keep the channels clear, literal and moral both. The channels. It seems right to end there for a moment. With water. Mesopotamia was always a river civilization. And river civilizations learn things rain-fed peoples do not always remember. They learn that order is maintenance. They learn that too little water kills, and too much water kills. They learn that boundaries must be renewed. Silt returns. Banks weaken. A canal neglected is not a neutral fact. It is an invitation to loss. Memory works like that too. So does justice. So does language. So does scientific culture. So does spiritual seriousness. Neglect them long enough, and the flood does not need to be mythic. It arrives by procedure. That may be the deepest warning of all. The return of catastrophe does not always announce itself with heavenly trumpets. Sometimes it looks like ordinary maintenance failing across too many systems at once. Rivers unmanaged. Archives corrupted. Rulers distracted. Rights emptied. Measures ignored. Soil exhausted. Speech debased. Children inheriting tools with no initiatory understanding of what those tools can do. By then, the old scribes would not say doom with dramatic satisfaction. They would say, very quietly, that the pattern has become recognizable again. And still, even here, the story does not leave us without gentleness. That matters. For all its sternness, Mesopotamian tradition is not empty of mercy. Ea warns the flood hero. Knowledge is hidden rather than lost utterly. Prophecies are written down rather than withheld. Return is announced in advance through signs, in cycles, omens, and inherited calculation. Even divine absence is not total abandonment. Enough remains for recovery. Enough remains for one more generation to choose seriousness over drift. That is mercy in an old style. Not rescue from consequence, but warning before it ripens completely. You know that feeling when someone older and wiser does not stop you from making every mistake, but leaves the door unlocked and the lamp lit in case you finally decide to come home. The Mesopotamian warning feels like that to me. Severe, yes, but not loveless. The tablets never say, humanity is beyond hope. They say humanity is forgetful. There is a difference. Forgetfulness can be resisted. Archives can be reopened. Skies can be watched again. Foundations can be studied. Rivers can be respected. Language can be cleaned. Pride can be reduced to proper size. The old patterns can be read without being worshipped foolishly. Knowledge can be paired with reverence again, if people choose the slower road. And if they do not, the warning remains what it has always been. Patient. Clay is so patient. It does not shout. It waits. It survives the hand that made it. It survives the ruler who commissioned it. It survives the interpreter who gets part of it wrong. It survives the museum label. It survives the century that thinks itself final. And then, one night, perhaps a night like this one, someone reads it carefully and feels the old current move again through the words. That is enough to keep the inheritance alive. So let the last image be a quiet one. Not a spaceship over a ziggurat. Not kings falling. Not a world ending in fire. Let it be a single tablet, resting in dim light. The surface is impressed with signs that once felt immediate and now feel ancient. But the clay is still here. Your hand does not quite touch it, only hovers. You see the slight ridges made by a stylus thousands of years ago. Someone breathed while writing those lines. Someone paused. Someone corrected a sign. Someone believed the future might one day need this warning. And because they were right, you are here. The room is still. Candlelight trembles. Somewhere beyond the walls, unseen water keeps moving in its old patient way. Deep time presses close, not to frighten you, but to remind you that your age is not alone in its uncertainty. Others stood under strange skies before you. Others inherited dangerous gifts. Others feared they were drifting out of alignment with a larger order. Others tried, imperfectly, to preserve what might help those who came later. Tonight, you have sat among them, and now the story asks for nothing more from you. No conclusion forced too tightly. No certainty manufactured for comfort. Only this quiet afterthought, laid gently in your hands like warm clay. If return is possible, then preparation matters. If return is only a metaphor, then preparation still matters. If the Anunnaki never come back in any literal form, the warning about pride, memory, stewardship, and civilizational fragility remains true enough to guide a century. And if, in some old and difficult way, the sky and the earth are moving toward one another again, Then the wisest thing a civilization can do is become worthy of being seen. The lamp burns lower. The watcher lowers his stylus. The temple roof cools beneath the stars. The buried chambers remain closed, but not forever. The rivers breathe in darkness. The numbers continue their patient turning. Dust settles on brick. Silence gathers around the clay without erasing it. And you, listener, do not need to solve the whole mystery tonight. You only need to rest with it. Let the old city recede into candlelight. Let the king lists fold back into shadow. Let the planets continue their long, cold arithmetic without asking anything more of your tired mind. Let the warning become softer now, less like an alarm and more like a distant bell heard across water. You have followed it far enough. The room is dim. The fire is kind. Your thoughts can loosen. Somewhere in the deep archive of the world, the clay remains. Somewhere above, the stars continue. Between them, humanity keeps its uncertain watch. And for now, that is all. Good night.